My name is Mark. I'm 29, and I've tried for months to understand how one stupid comment managed to blow up the only relationship I thought was unbreakable. The thing is, when it happened, it didn't feel like this explosive moment right away. It felt small, almost like one of those throwaway things people say when they think no one's really listening. But it hit me in a place I didn't even know was soft. The whole thing happened on a random Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that should have been boring enough to forget. I had driven to my dad's house because he asked me to help move some old stuff out of the garage, and I figured it'd just be a couple of hours, some boxes, maybe a coffee after. Nothing dramatic. The garage was hot and smelled like dust and motor oil, exactly like it did when I was a kid, and I remember thinking it was weird how memories sneak up on you when you're not expecting it. I was tired from the week, maybe a little stressed, but nothing unusual. I didn't walk in expecting my life to change. I just walked in carrying a box, listening to him talk about random things, feeling like everything was normal. And then he said it. And everything I thought I knew about us cracked like a cheap plate someone dropped on the floor. It started with him asking if I had figured my life out yet, which he had said practically every time we saw each other for the past 2 years, ever since I switched jobs. Normally, I just brushed it off, but I was already feeling irritated from the heat and the dust getting in my throat. I told him I was doing fine, that the new job was going well, and that I was actually proud of myself for how I'd turned things around after a rough patch earlier this year. I expected him to at least nod or say something encouraging, but instead, he let out this laugh that didn't sound like a joke at all. Then he said the line that's been stuck in my head ever since. You know, sometimes I wonder if I failed as a father because you turned out, well, like this. Like this. That's all he said. No explanation. No softening. Just those 2 words, tossed out like they didn't mean anything. I froze. I remember the exact way his voice sounded. Flat, a little disappointed, like he had been holding that thought for a long time. I remember the way he didn't even look at me when he said it, just kept sorting through a box of old tools like he was talking about the weather. And in that moment, something in my chest dropped. I don't know why that hit so hard, but it did. It felt like he was finally saying out loud everything I had secretly suspected he thought of me. I asked him what he meant by like this, and he just shrugged, like the question annoyed him. He said something about me not being where a man my age should be, and it was the way he said it, like he had already judged me, weighed me, measured me, and found me lacking. I'd been doing everything I could to rebuild my life, and he knew that. He knew how messy things had been after my breakup, how hard I worked to get stable again, how much I tried to fix things without asking him for help. I felt my face getting hot, but not from the heat of the garage. It was embarrassment first, then anger, then this weird mixture of shame and disbelief. I told him I was doing my best, and he just shook his head like it didn't matter. There was this silence between us, but not the quiet kind. It was the kind that fills every corner of a room and makes it hard to breathe. I felt stupid standing there holding a half-torn cardboard box, like a grown man who somehow reverted back to being a kid waiting for his dad's approval. Except this time, there wasn't even the possibility of getting it. Something shifted then, in a way I can't really explain. It was like the ground tilted just a tiny bit under me, and suddenly everything felt different. The worst part is that he didn't even notice the impact of what he said. He just kept sorting things, humming some old song, acting like nothing happened. I stood there replaying the comment in my head over and over until it felt louder than anything else in the garage. There was this old photo album sticking halfway out of a box, the one he kept all my childhood pictures in, and for some reason, that made everything hit even harder. I used to think he was proud of me. I used to believe that no matter how messy things got, he still saw me as someone worth supporting. My hands were shaking a little, not from anger exactly, but from something deeper I didn't know how to name. I put the box down because I didn't trust myself not to drop it. I told him I needed some air and stepped outside. The sun was hitting the driveway, and everything looked too bright, too normal, too calm for the way my chest felt like it was tightening. I didn't want to cry in front of him, and I didn't want to yell either. I just needed distance. But even standing outside, the comment wouldn't leave my head. It felt like it had been waiting all along, like a hidden truth he finally let slip. When I walked back inside, he acted like I had left for 30 seconds instead of several minutes. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't acknowledge anything. And that was the moment I realized something I still hate admitting. He didn't see anything wrong with what he said. To him, it was just honesty. To me, it was a punch to the gut I didn't see coming. I told him I was heading home, and he barely looked up, just said, "All right," like it didn't matter. I drove away feeling like I was leaving a funeral, and as much as I tried to shake it off, the words kept replaying in my head the entire ride home. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about every moment in my life when I thought he was proud of me, and wondering if I had imagined all of it. It's strange how one comment, one stupid, careless, offhand comment, can pull a thread that unravels years of memories. I wish I could say we talked it out later, or that he apologized, or that this turned into some bonding moment. But that day was the start of something I still haven't figured out how to fix. And maybe I never will. Over the next few days, I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that maybe I was just tired or emotionally overloaded from work and life, and everything else piling up at once. But every time I replayed the moment in the garage, I felt that same sting in my chest, like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing. I didn't talk to him, and he didn't reach out either, which honestly made things worse. It was like he didn't even remember what he'd said. Or worse, he remembered and still didn't care enough to check on me. I tried distracting myself, burying my head in work, going to the gym more often, meeting up with friends just to avoid being alone with my thoughts. But it didn't matter. The silence between us grew heavier every day. My mom texted me asking why I hadn't visited in a while, and I told her I'd been busy. She didn't push, which I appreciated, but I had this feeling she sensed something was off. I kept thinking about confronting him, telling him how much that comment hurt. But every time I imagined the conversation, I pictured him doing the same thing he did that day, shrugging it off, telling me I was too sensitive, making me feel small all over again. So I stayed quiet, hoping the feeling would fade. It didn't. 2 weeks later, my sister Emily invited me over for dinner at her place. She said she wanted to catch up, but I knew she always had a sixth sense about family tension. She's younger than me, but somehow she always saw things I didn't. I almost canceled, but I didn't want to worry her, so I went. The moment I walked in, she took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told her it was nothing, but she gave me that stare she always gives when she knows I'm lying. So I told her, not everything, but enough. The garage, the comment, the way I felt afterward. She got quiet, really quiet. Then she sighed and said, "He's been like this with me too." That surprised me. I always thought our dad treated her differently, softer, maybe because she was the youngest. But she said he'd been making these passive-aggressive remarks to her about her career choices, her relationship, her plans for the future. Nothing as blunt as what he said to me, but enough to make her feel judged. Hearing that made me feel less crazy, but it also made everything heavier. It wasn't just me. It was a pattern. And somehow, that hurt even more. I left Emily's place feeling frustrated, but also validated, like maybe I wasn't losing my mind after all. The real breaking point came a week later, when my mom asked if I could stop by for Sunday lunch. I wasn't planning to go, but she said she had made my favorite dish, and I didn't want to disappoint her. I told myself I could handle being in the same room as him, that maybe enough time had passed for things to feel normal again. I was wrong. The moment I walked in, he greeted me like nothing had happened, like we hadn't gone weeks without speaking. That alone pissed me off, but I tried to brush it off. We sat at the table, and Mom was talking about some renovation project she wanted to start. Then out of nowhere, he looked at me and said, "Maybe you should help her. Might give you some direction." He said it casually, like a joke, but the tone wasn't joking at all. It felt like the garage all over again, but worse, because this time my mom was there, and I felt this wave of humiliation wash over me. I felt my jaw tighten, and Emily, who had joined us too, shot me a quick look like she already knew what was coming. I didn't explode, but I also didn't hide how I felt. I told him that comment was unnecessary, and he rolled his eyes like I was being dramatic. That was it. That was the moment I snapped inside, even if I didn't show it on the outside. After lunch, I stayed behind to help my mom with the dishes, mostly to avoid talking to him. She could feel the tension. She kept glancing at me like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. When he went to the living room, she finally asked if something was going on between us. I told her what happened in the garage. At first, she tried defending him, saying he didn't mean things the way they came out, that he had been stressed about finances, about getting older, about everything piling up. But the more I talked, the more her face shifted. She wasn't defending him anymore. She looked sad, almost defeated. Then she said something that stuck with me. He doesn't realize how much his words hurt because no one ever told him. And maybe she was right. Maybe his entire life, people just let his behavior slide, shrugged it off, avoided conflict. I drove home feeling torn between understanding him and resenting him. That night, I sat on my couch staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was something I needed to work through or something I needed to walk away from. The answer wasn't clear. I didn't talk to him again for the next month. I didn't block him, didn't send a dramatic message, didn't make any big announcement. I just disappeared from his daily life. No calls, no visits, no texts. He didn't reach out either, which told me everything I needed to know. My mom texted more often during that time, checking up on me, asking how work was going, sending me random pictures of the dog, little things to keep a connection alive. Emily kept telling me to do whatever I needed to for my mental peace, even if that meant putting distance between us and Dad. I spent that whole month trying to understand the difference between taking space and giving up entirely. It felt weird not having him in my life, like a background noise I'd gotten used to suddenly going silent. But it also felt lighter, calmer, and that made me feel guilty. I kept thinking maybe I should talk to him, try to fix things, but then I'd remember the way he looked at me in the garage, the way he dismissed everything I said at lunch, and the guilt would turn into anger again. I didn't know where any of this was headed. I just knew I wasn't ready to go back. About a month later, out of nowhere, he finally called. I was in the middle of cooking dinner, and when I saw his name pop up on my phone, my stomach dropped in that way it does when something unresolved suddenly shows up again. I let it ring twice before answering, mostly because my hands were shaking a little. His voice sounded normal, too normal, like he had just stepped out for a second and was calling to see if I wanted something from the store. He asked how I'd been, and I said fine, keeping my voice flat. He didn't mention the silence between us, didn't ask if something was wrong, just went straight into asking if I could help him with something around the house the next weekend. It was like he had mentally reset everything, like the argument, the comment, the distance, it all meant nothing. Hearing him talk like that made something twist in my chest. I realized then that for him, problems only existed if he felt inconvenienced by them. So I told him I was busy that weekend, which was a lie, and he said, "All right," in this tone that made it sound like I was being difficult for no reason. That call lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it took me hours to calm down afterward. I couldn't figure out if he truly didn't remember what he'd said, or if he remembered perfectly and just didn't care. A couple of days later, Emily texted me saying Dad had been acting strange, quiet, irritated, pacing around more than usual. She said she didn't know what happened between us, but it was definitely starting to show. That pulled me into this weird spiral of guilt again. I hate that about family. How you can be hurting, but somehow end up feeling responsible for the person who hurt you. I went back and forth for hours trying to decide if I should call him, just to clear the air, but every time I got close to hitting the call button, I froze. I didn't want to go back into that cycle of pretending something wasn't wrong. I didn't want to be the only one trying. I ended up texting my mom instead, asking if everything was okay. She replied almost immediately, telling me things were fine, in that way moms do when things are absolutely not fine. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just between me and my dad anymore. The tension was bleeding into the whole family. That made me feel even more pressure, like I was holding something fragile that could crack if I didn't handle it perfectly. But at the same time, I kept thinking, why did it always have to be me fixing things? One night, I got home from work and found a letter taped to my door. My dad's handwriting is impossible to miss. Big, slightly crooked letters that always looked rushed. My heart started pounding as I pulled it off the door. I stood there for a second, not sure if I wanted to open it. I mean, who even writes letters anymore? It felt dramatic, but also serious. When I finally opened it, the letter wasn't long. Just a couple of paragraphs. He wrote that he felt like we'd been off lately, and he wasn't sure why. That alone made me grit my teeth. Then he wrote that he hoped I wasn't holding on to anything small, because life is too short for grudges. Reading the word small almost made me laugh out loud, but not in a funny way. He had taken the biggest emotional punch I'd received from him in years and reduced it to something insignificant, something I should just get over. There was no apology, no recognition of what he'd said, just a vague attempt to move past everything without actually addressing it. I sat on my couch with that letter in my hand, feeling this mix of sadness and anger and exhaustion that made my whole body feel heavy. I didn't respond to the letter. Not immediately, anyway. I put it in a drawer in my kitchen, the one where I toss things I don't know what to do with. Old receipts, takeout menus, spare keys. For the next week, I kept thinking about what I could possibly say to him. Everything I came up with sounded either too angry or too desperate or too pointless. At one point, I even wrote out a long message on my phone telling him exactly how his words made me feel, how deeply it cut, how it made me question our entire relationship. But I deleted it before I even finished. It felt like throwing a message into a void. I knew that if he didn't understand the first time, he wasn't going to suddenly understand now. And that made me feel even more alone. I started spending more time out of the house, going on long drives just to clear my head, walking around stores without buying anything to avoid sitting still long enough for the thoughts to build up again. It was like trying to outrun something that kept catching up no matter how fast I moved. Then one night, around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with a call from my mom. She never calls that late. When I answered, her voice was shaky, and I could hear something in the background. Maybe the TV, maybe the sound of someone walking back and forth. She said Dad had gotten into a big argument with a neighbor over something stupid, and afterward he'd locked himself in the garage. She couldn't get him to come inside. Hearing that sent this cold feeling through me. It wasn't about the neighbor. It was everything else weighing on him. The aging, the stress, the tension in the family, maybe even the silence between us, even if he never admitted it. For a second, I thought about driving over there. I even grabbed my keys. But then I stopped. I stood in the hallway of my apartment holding my keys and realized I had no idea what I would even say to him. No idea if seeing me would help or make things worse. I told my mom to keep me updated, and she said she would. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floor, feeling this strange mix of worry and resentment. I cared about him. Of course I did. But caring didn't erase the distance. The next morning, my mom texted saying he finally came inside around 2 a.m., didn't say a word, just went straight to bed. I felt relieved in a weird way, but also heavier, like every part of this situation was turning into a knot I didn't know how to untie. For the rest of the week, things stayed tense. My mom said he was quieter than usual, sitting in the living room without the TV on, staring at the wall like he was thinking about something but never saying what. She said he wasn't angry, just distant. Hearing that sent this strange wave of guilt through me again. I didn't know if I was part of the reason he was unraveling or if this was something that had been building long before the garage incident. And that uncertainty messed with me. Meanwhile, my life kept moving. Work, errands, the usual routine, but everything felt off, like I was watching my own days happen from the outside. At night, I found myself lying awake, wondering if staying away was the right thing or if I was just being stubborn. Part of me wanted to text him, to start with something small, something safe. But another part of me couldn't forget the way he minimized everything, the way he refused to see any fault in himself. That part kept winning. About a week later, I finally agreed to visit my parents for dinner after my mom insisted. I didn't want to, but she sounded tired, stretched thin, like she was carrying too much on her own. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw his truck parked there, but the garage door was closed, which was unusual. He always kept it open when he was home. Walking into the house felt strange, familiar, but tense. My mom hugged me a little longer than usual, and Emily was there too, which helped. But Dad stayed in the living room, pretending to be focused on some news program even though the volume was low. I said, "Hey," and he muttered something back without looking at me. Dinner felt like sitting in a room wired with explosives. Everyone careful, everyone too quiet, everyone pretending not to notice how uncomfortable it all was. At one point, my mom tried to start a light conversation about a family friend's baby shower, but Dad cut in with, "Let's not pretend everything's normal." The room froze. Emily stared at him. My mom sighed. I felt my chest tighten. He finally looked at me then, but it wasn't anger in his eyes. It was something else. Something tired. Something confused. Something I wasn't prepared for. He asked, in front of everyone, why I was avoiding him. I didn't want to have that conversation at the table, but he was staring at me like he needed an answer right then. So I told him, not everything, not the full emotional weight, but enough. Enough for him to know the garage comment wasn't small, enough for him to know it stuck with me, enough for him to know I didn't pull away for no reason. He blinked a few times, like he couldn't process what I was saying. Then he said, "I didn't mean it like that," with this tone that landed somewhere between defensive and confused. I told him it didn't matter how he meant it. It mattered how it hit. He got quiet again, and for a second, part of me hoped he'd apologize, really apologize. But instead he said something that made everything inside me drop. "You're too sensitive, Mark. You've always been." It was like watching the last bit of hope I'd been holding collapse in real time. Emily exhaled sharply. My mom closed her eyes like she'd heard that line too many times in her life. I stood up from the table because suddenly it felt like there wasn't enough air in the room. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stepped away before I said something I couldn't undo. I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the front door. My mom followed me, asking me not to leave, telling me things would calm down if we all just took a moment. But I was done talking in circles. I told her I loved her, told her I loved Emily, and that I wasn't cutting the family out. I just couldn't keep putting myself in the same loop with him. She nodded, but I could tell it broke her heart a little. I walked to my car, and when I looked back, I saw my dad standing in the doorway, half hidden behind the frame. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He just looked lost, like he didn't understand how things got to this point. And that image has stuck with me ever since. I drove home in silence. No music, nothing. Just this weird emptiness I wasn't expecting. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't disappointment. It was something colder, something that felt like acceptance in the worst way possible. Like realizing the person you kept trying to reach was never standing close enough to hear you in the first place. It's been months since that dinner, and we haven't spoken since. Not because I'm holding a grudge, but because there's nothing left to say. I've replayed that garage moment more times than I want to admit, trying to understand if there was something I missed, some sign that could explain why it hit so hard. But every time I try to make sense of it, I end up in the same place. It wasn't just that one comment. It was a lifetime of small cuts I didn't notice until one finally went deep enough to bleed. Sometimes I still get this weird urge to call him, just to check if he's okay, but something stops me every time. Not anger, just this feeling that the version of him I miss never really existed the way I imagined. And the strangest part is how the whole thing started with one sentence tossed out in a dusty garage on a boring Saturday afternoon. A sentence he probably doesn't even remember. But it changed everything. And I still can't fully explain why. It just did. It's like it cracked something open inside me. And once it cracked, nothing fit back the same way again. And maybe that's the part one can't get over. The way something so simple can break something you thought would last forever.